Case 1. Deanna Laney, Texas. Tyler, Texas, May 9, 2003. The 911 dispatch center received a call shortly after midnight that would haunt veteran operators for years to come. The woman on the line spoke with an eerie calmness, her words carrying no panic or distress. "I've killed my boys," she stated matter-of-factly. When officers rushed to the rural property outside Tyler, Texas, they encountered a scene that defied comprehension. Two young children, Joshua, age 8, and Luke, age 6, lay motionless in the backyard. Their 14-month-old brother, Aaron, clung to life in his crib with severe head injuries. The woman responsible for their death stood waiting for police without attempting to flee. Her name was Deanna Laney, a 38-year-old Sunday school teacher known throughout her community as a devoted mother and woman of faith. Laney's background revealed no indicators of violence. Raised in Texas with strong Christian values, she had dedicated her adult life to family and worship. Neighbors knew her as gentle and nurturing, someone who poured herself into caring for her 3 sons. Her home, nestled among the woods far from urban distractions, seemed an idyllic setting for raising children. But beneath this peaceful exterior, something catastrophic had been building. Throughout the spring of 2003, Laney experienced what she believed was direct communication from God. She became increasingly fixated on biblical passages, particularly the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. Unlike most believers who understood this as an ancient test of faith that God ultimately stopped, Laney interpreted it as a literal instruction meant for her. Friends later recalled conversations where Laney spoke about spiritual trials and divine testing. She referenced end-times prophecy with growing intensity and claimed God had selected her for a special purpose. These warning signs, visible in hindsight, went unrecognized as dangerous at the time. On that fateful May evening, after her husband retired for the night, Laney brought Joshua and Luke into the backyard. Using heavy stones she had gathered earlier, she struck each boy repeatedly in the head until they ceased moving. She then entered the house and attacked infant Aaron as he slept. By some miracle, the youngest child survived, though he sustained traumatic injuries. After completing these horrific acts, Laney telephoned emergency services and confessed without hesitation. When law enforcement arrived, she guided them to her son's bodies. During subsequent interrogation, her explanation sent chills through investigators. She insisted God had commanded her to sacrifice her children as a test of faith, and she had trusted that divine intervention would restore them to life if she proved obedient. The tragedy ignited fierce national debate. How could a loving mother commit such atrocities? What could drive someone to believe the creator of the universe demanded child sacrifice? As prosecutors prepared their case, psychiatric evaluations revealed a deeply troubling picture. Laney had no history whatsoever of criminal behavior, violence, or substance abuse. However, in the months preceding the murders, she had exhibited unmistakable signs of severe psychotic illness. Her religious beliefs had transformed into delusions, auditory hallucinations she genuinely perceived as God's voice, symptoms of profound mental deterioration that went unrecognized and untreated. The 2004 trial forced jurors to wrestle with an agonizing question: should Laney be held criminally accountable, or was she legally insane at the time of her crimes? 5 independent mental health professionals, including experts retained by the prosecution, testified unanimously that Laney had been experiencing active psychosis during the attacks. She could not distinguish reality from delusion or understand the moral implications of her actions. After careful deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that sparked controversy nationwide. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Rather than imprisonment, Laney was committed indefinitely to North Texas State Hospital, a maximum-security psychiatric facility. This outcome reignited long-standing debates about the insanity defense, particularly in cases involving religious delusion. Over subsequent years, Laney received intensive psychiatric treatment. Medical reports documented gradual improvement, and after exhaustive evaluations, she eventually qualified for conditional release. This decision required rigorous oversight, mandatory medication compliance, ongoing therapy, and strict supervision protocols. Courts and clinicians agreed she no longer represented a threat provided she maintained treatment. Today, Laney resides in a supervised setting away from public attention. Her surviving son Aaron was raised by extended family members who have largely shielded him from media scrutiny. He carries not only physical and emotional scars, but also the impossible burden of being the child who lived. The Laney case remains among the most haunting examples of untreated mental illness colliding with intense religious conviction. It forces society to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, accountability, and the fragile boundaries of human sanity. And it leaves behind a devastating reality. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from malice or hatred, but from a mind so fractured by illness that maternal love becomes unrecognizable. Case 2, Allison Fluke Ekron, Kansas, Syria. Kansas to Syria, 2008 to 2022. When federal agents escorted her onto American soil in 2022, even experienced counterterrorism officials found it difficult to reconcile her origins with her ultimate destination. She had grown up in the heartland of America, earned a university degree, and worked as a schoolteacher. Yet somewhere along the way, this ordinary woman from Kansas had transformed into a military commander for ISIS, training fighters and plotting attacks against her own country. Allison Fluke Ekron was born and raised in Overbrook, Kansas, seemingly destined for conventional Middle American life. She pursued higher education at the University of Kansas, where she earned a biology degree. After graduation, she entered the teaching profession, married, and started a family. For years, she lived quietly in the Midwest with no visible connection to extremism or radicalism. The turning point came sometime after 2008. Following a move overseas with her husband, later identified as a known ISIS operative, Fluke Ekron began gravitating toward radical Islamist ideology. The couple relocated multiple times, from Egypt to Libya and eventually to Syria, following the expansion of extremist militant groups across the Middle East. As the Islamic State consolidated power, Fluke Ekron didn't merely accompany her husband as a passive spouse. She actively pursued leadership roles within the organization. According to federal prosecutors, Fluke Ekron helped establish Katiba Nusayba, an all-female military battalion operating in Raqqa, the de facto capital of the ISIS Caliphate. She assumed command responsibilities, training over 100 women and girls, some barely teenagers, in weapons handling, explosive devices, and combat tactics. Witnesses who escaped the caliphate describe her as authoritarian, demanding, and completely devoted to ISIS ideology. Fluke Ekron reportedly glorified martyrdom operations and actively encouraged a student to pursue suicide missions. Training exercises included instruction with AK-47 rifles and fragmentation grenades. But her curriculum extended beyond physical combat. She worked to indoctrinate recruits psychologically, presenting violent extremism as religious duty and divine truth. Her influence wasn't confined to Syrian battlefields. During her time with ISIS, Fluke Ekron allegedly participated in discussions about orchestrating terrorist attacks within the United States. One proposed operation targeted a university campus. Another involved detonating a vehicle-borne explosive device at an American shopping center. While these plots never materialized, the mere fact that she engaged in such planning demonstrated the depth of her transformation and her willingness to harm her fellow Americans. The eventual collapse of the ISIS Caliphate forced Fluke Ekron into hiding as Syrian and Kurdish forces reclaimed territory. In early 2022, local authorities apprehended her and facilitated her extradition to the United States, where she faced federal terrorism charges. The evidence against her proved overwhelming. Former students testified about her military training programs. Digital communications revealed her involvement in operational planning. Intelligence analysts identified her as one of the most prominent American women to join ISIS in a leadership capacity, not as a supporter or wife, but as a commander and organizer. Confronted with this mountain of evidence, Fluke Ekron entered a guilty plea to one count of conspiracy to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. During her November 2022 sentencing hearing, she attempted to minimize certain allegations and express some regret. However, the judge emphasized that her actions had empowered a brutal terrorist organization, endangered children, and inspired violence against innocent civilians. She received the maximum sentence available, 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom heard painful testimony from some of her own children, including a daughter who described years of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. Her daughter testified that Fluke Ekron had weaponized ideology, twisting religious texts to justify control, and celebrating violence as sacred duty. The case became one of the most significant examples of Western women joining ISIS in operational roles. While male combatants typically dominate headlines, Fluke-Ekran revealed the organizational and ideological power that female operatives could exercise. She wasn't simply a supportive wife. She was an instructor of warfare, a planner of terrorist attacks, and a symbol of how radical ideology can completely transform even seemingly stable individuals. For counterterrorism professionals, her story serves as a cautionary tale. It demonstrated how an educated, middle-class American could descend into violent extremism not through poverty or coercion, but through belief powerful enough to make her abandon her country, her career, and even her children's well-being in pursuit of what she claimed was a holy mission. Today, Alison Fluke-Ekran served her sentence in a federal correctional facility. She faces permanent restrictions prohibiting contact with extremist organizations, and her name is indelibly recorded in the history of American citizens who betrayed their homeland for ideology. Yet her story continues to resonate in courtrooms, de-radicalization programs, and in the persistent concern that somewhere else, someone is watching, listening, and beginning to embrace the same dangerous lies. Case 3, Magali Barmu, London, UK. East London, December 25, 2010. Emergency responders received a distress call on Christmas Day 2010 that shattered the holiday spirit. When they arrived at a flat in East London, what they discovered wasn't a festive accident or medical emergency. It was evidence of sustained, calculated brutality. A 15-year-old boy named Christy Barmu lay dead in a bathtub, his body covered in injuries. The person responsible was his own sister. Magali Barmu was 28 years old, living in Newham with her boyfriend Eric Bakubi. Originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, she had immigrated to Britain as a teenager. By all external appearances, she led an unremarkable existence. However, both she and Bakubi harbored deeply ingrained beliefs in Kindoki, a form of witchcraft feared in some Congolese communities. In their worldview, spiritual possession represented a tangible threat requiring violent intervention. In December 2010, Christy and several of his siblings traveled from Paris to London for what should have been a joyful family holiday reunion. Instead, the visit devolved into a multi-day nightmare that would end in murder. Shortly after the children's arrival, Bakubi began accusing Christy of harboring evil spirits. Magali supported these allegations. Fueled by paranoia, religious obsession, and escalating rage, the couple claimed the teenager was practicing witchcraft and needed to undergo a violent exorcism. What followed was a prolonged campaign of torture. Over several days, Christy endured beatings with metal bars, hammers, ceramic floor tiles, and pliers. The couple forced him to pray for spiritual deliverance and coerced confessions that he was possessed by demons. The violence continued relentlessly while neighbors heard concerning noises but never imagined the horror unfolding inside. Christy's younger siblings were also threatened and accused, but he bore the primary brunt of the assault. By the ordeal's conclusion, he could barely remain standing. According to trial testimony, he eventually begged his sister and Bakubi to end his life. They complied by drowning him in the bathtub. He was just 15 years old. After Christy's death, Magali contacted emergency services. Police arriving at the scene found the apartment in chaos. Blood-stained covered floors, furniture lay broken, and traumatized children huddled in corners. Christy's body remained in the tub, bearing over 100 distinct wounds. Both Magali and Bakubi were immediately arrested. During police interrogation, both confessed to believing Christy had been practicing Kindoki. They characterized the violence as an attempt to purge demonic influence, reflecting sectarian Christian teachings that blended scripture with superstition. Prosecutors, however, made the case crystal clear. Regardless of their beliefs, what they committed was torture followed by murder. The 2012 trial of the Old Bailey exposed jurors to harrowing testimony from Christy's siblings who had witnessed portions of the torture. The prosecution presented the crime as a tragic convergence of religious fanaticism, controlling behavior, and sadistic cruelty. Evidence showed that Bakubi had a documented history of mental health problems, but possessed sufficient awareness to understand his actions. Magali displayed minimal emotion throughout the proceedings. While she admitted participating in the violence, she frequently attempted to shift responsibility onto Bakubi's influence. The jury, however, saw through the defense strategy. In March 2012, both Magali Barmu and Eric Bakubi were convicted of murder. At sentencing, the judge delivered a stern condemnation. He acknowledged that belief in witchcraft may have been sincere but emphasized that no belief system, however genuinely held, could justify such brutality. He characterized the torture as prolonged, sadistic, and ultimately fatal. Bakubi received a life sentence with a 30-year minimum term before parole eligibility. Magali was sentenced to life with a 25-year minimum. The verdict sent shockwaves throughout the United Kingdom, not only due to the horrifying details but because it exposed an undercurrent of imported superstition that had gone largely unaddressed. British authorities had documented previous smaller incidents involving Kindoki-based abuse, particularly targeting children. But Christie's death thrust the issue into painful national focus. In response, the government launched awareness campaigns in immigrant communities and educational institutions, encouraging vigilance against harmful traditional beliefs disguised as religious practice. Social services agencies reevaluated their outreach strategies, especially in communities where fear of spiritual possession remained prevalent. However, no policy reform could reverse what had happened to Christie. His murder represented not just a family tragedy, but a systemic failure, a failure to recognize the danger of unchecked beliefs, a failure to protect a vulnerable child in crisis, and a failure by two adults who transformed faith into violence. Today, Magali Bamu remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence for helping to end her brother's life. The apartment that once hosted their family reunion stands empty, but its memory endures as a grim reminder of what can transpire when superstition becomes justification, and when familial love is warped by irrational fear. Case 4, Tashfin Malik, Pakistan, California. San Bernardino, California, December 2nd, 2015. The holiday gathering at the Inland Regional Center had just begun. Colleagues mingled, shared food, and celebrated the season together. Among them appeared a familiar face, quiet, modest, nearly invisible in the festive crowd. But she hadn't come to celebrate. Minutes later, she and her husband entered the building armed with assault weapons, opening fire in what would become one of California's deadliest mass shootings. Tashfin Malik's origins were far removed from Southern California. Born in Pakistan in 1986, she spent much of her youth in Saudi Arabia within a conservative Islamic household. By most accounts, her early years passed without incident, reserved, religious, and structured. She later returned to Pakistan to study pharmacy at Bahauddin Zakaria University. During these university years, her ideological perspective began shifting, though she remained publicly quiet about politics or extremism. In 2013, she connected with Syed Rizwan Farooq, a U.S.-born health inspector from Riverside, California, through an online matrimonial service. He too identified as devoutly religious and sought a wife sharing his conservative values. After a brief courtship, they married, and Malik relocated to San Bernardino on a fiancé visa, quickly disappearing from public view. Neighbors recalled minimal interaction with the couple, who lived quietly while raising their infant daughter in a modest residence. Outwardly, their life appeared entirely typical. Behind closed doors, however, the couple was accumulating weapons, conducting target practice at shooting ranges, and expressing extremist beliefs through private digital communications. According to FBI investigations, they underwent self-radicalization over several years. They had no formal affiliation with any official terror cell, but their ideology closely aligned with ISIS messaging. In fact, on the attack date, Malik pledged allegiance to the group's leader via Facebook just moments before the shooting commenced. On the morning of December 2nd, 2015, Syed Farooq attended a holiday training event at the San Bernardino Department of Public Health where he worked. Around midday, he abruptly departed. 2 hours later, he returned accompanied by Tashfin Malik. Both wore tactical gear and carried heavy armament. They entered the conference room and opened fire on Farooq's colleagues, many of whom had shared lunch with him just hours earlier. The attack lasted only minutes but resulted in 14 deaths and 22 injuries. The shooting was methodical, calculated, and devastating. After the massacre, the couple fled in a black SUV, leaving behind a pipe bomb that failed to detonate. A massive manhunt ensued across the region. 4 hours after the initial attack, police located them just miles from the original scene. A high-speed pursuit and intense shootout followed. When the gunfire ceased, both Farooq and Malik lay dead. Inside their vehicle and residence, authorities discovered thousands of rounds of ammunition, improvised explosive devices, and a clear digital trail documenting their ideological radicalization. Because both perpetrators died during the confrontation, there would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, no direct interrogation. However, through digital forensics, investigators reconstructed the couple's path to violence. Malik had communicated with extremists overseas and consumed extensive radical content online. In the months preceding the attack, the couple had meticulously planned every detail. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was premeditated domestic terrorism. Public reaction proved swift and far-reaching. The San Bernardino attack marked a watershed moment in how Americans perceived homegrown extremism. The scale of violence was shocking enough, but the perpetrator's profile, a married couple with an infant at home, made it even more disturbing. There had been no obvious warning signs, no prior arrests, no known connections to terror groups. They had successfully blended into their community. This invisibility was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. The case also sparked urgent questions about immigration screening procedures. Malik had passed multiple background checks when entering the U.S. on a K-1 visa, yet her extremist leanings went undetected. Critics demanded stricter vetting processes, particularly for fiancé and spousal visa applications. In response, the Department of Homeland Security implemented new protocols expanding social media screening and interagency information sharing. Within days, the FBI formally classified the shooting as an act of terrorism. Subsequent investigation confirmed the attack was ideologically motivated but not directed by ISIS leadership. The couple had drawn inspiration from the group's propaganda but acted independently. This decentralized model made their case especially difficult to predict and even harder to prevent. In the aftermath, victim stories began emerging. Health workers, environmental specialists, and office staff who had gathered for a holiday luncheon never returned home. Their loss left a devastating wound in the San Bernardino community. Memorials were held nationwide, and support poured in from government officials and ordinary citizens alike. Tashfin Malik's name remains infamous not only for the violence she helped unleash but for what she represented. She was a quiet woman who didn't attract suspicion, the young mother who shopped at local stores, the neighbor who seemed completely normal. And yet she carried out one of the most devastating mass shootings in recent American history. There was no manifesto, no courtroom apology, no final statement. Just a trail of digital evidence, a pattern of ideological radicalization, and the graves of 14 innocent victims who died during what should have been a joyful celebration. Case 5, Colleen LaRose, Jihad Jane, Pennsylvania. Pennsburg, Pennsylvania, 2009. She appeared entirely unremarkable, a blonde, blue-eyed woman from suburban Pennsylvania. Quiet and unassuming, she volunteered at her apartment complex and cared for her boyfriend's elderly father. But behind her computer screen, she adopted the alias Jihad Jane and plotted an assassination she believed would serve a holy cause. Colleen LaRose's journey to radicalization didn't begin with violence. It began with profound loneliness. Born in Michigan in 1963, she endured a difficult childhood marked by trauma and abuse. She dropped out of school during her early teenage years, married young, and eventually relocated to Texas. Over the decades, LaRose struggled with depression, substance abuse, and a series of failed relationships. By her mid-40s, she was living in Pennsylvania and spending the majority of her time online. In 2008, after watching a YouTube video depicting Muslims suffering in war zones, LaRose suddenly converted to Islam. The transformation was abrupt, intense, and all-consuming. She adopted the name Fatima LaRose and began frequenting extremist internet forums, expressing anger toward Western foreign policy and sympathy for jihadist movements. Online, she discovered something that had eluded her in the physical world, a sense of belonging and purpose. LaRose soon connected with a loosely organized network of radicals. Through encrypted communications and message boards, she established contact with operatives in Europe and the Middle East who recognized her potential value. An American woman with a clean criminal record and the ability to travel undetected represented a significant asset. Her assigned mission became clear: assassinate Swedish artist Lars Vilks, who had created cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad in ways some Muslims found deeply offensive. The plan was both bizarre and genuinely dangerous. LaRose was instructed to fly to Europe, locate Vilks, and kill him with the understanding that such an act would grant her martyrdom. She agreed without hesitation. In August 2009, without informing anyone, she boarded a flight to Ireland with the intention of joining others plotting the attack. However, executing a murder proved far more complicated than the online world had suggested. Once overseas, LaRose struggled to coordinate with her contacts and lacked clear operational guidance. After several weeks of confusion, she returned to the United States and was promptly arrested by the FBI, which had been monitoring her digital activity for months. Her online bravado had left an unmistakable trail: emails, aliases, and messages detailing her plans and motivations. In custody, LaRose confessed to her role in the conspiracy and cooperated with investigators. She admitted to providing material support to terrorists, conspiring to commit murder overseas, and recruiting others to join extremist causes. What shocked many observers wasn't just her crime but who she was. She didn't fit conventional stereotypes. She wasn't from the Middle East, had no criminal history, and had never visited a conflict zone. She was a proverbial woman next door. Prosecutors characterized LaRose as dangerously self-radicalized, noting that she had taken concrete steps toward completing the assassination mission despite ultimately failing. Her defense attorneys emphasized her troubled past, mental health struggles, and vulnerability to manipulation. They portrayed her less as a hardened terrorist and more as someone who had been exploited by ideological predators operating online. In 2014, after 4 years in custody, Colleen LaRose was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The relatively lenient sentence, given the gravity of the charges, was largely attributed to her cooperation with authorities and the fact that she never successfully executed an attack. She apologized in court, describing herself as ashamed and regretful. The judge acknowledged her remorse while also noting the seriousness of plotting to kill in the name of faith. The broader impact of LaRose's case proved significant. She became emblematic of a growing concern: the power of the internet to radicalize individuals who might otherwise never encounter extremist ideologies. Her story highlighted how even people far removed from traditional radicalization hotspots could be drawn into violent belief systems through a screen and an online alias. The Jihad Jane nickname became a media sensation, but experts cautioned that the catchy label risked oversimplifying a complex issue. LaRose wasn't merely a curiosity or oddity. She represented a wake-up call. Her case underscored the urgent need for more sophisticated strategies to detect lone wolf actors, especially those radicalized in the shadows of the digital landscape. Since completing her sentence, LaRose has maintained an extremely low profile. She has granted no interviews and made no public statements. Her current whereabouts remain unknown, and she is believed to be under close supervision. Colleen LaRose never fired a weapon or detonated an explosive device, but she crossed a critical line, one where violent fantasies transformed into concrete plans and personal pain evolved into political rage. In doing so, she left behind more than a court record. She left a haunting question that continues to trouble counterterrorism experts: how many others might be out there, quietly listening, quietly believing, and quietly waiting for their moment? Case 6, Wanda Bazi, Utah. Salt Lake City, Utah, June 5, 2002. It was a warm summer evening in Salt Lake City when 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart disappeared from a bedroom without a trace. The window screen had been cut clean through. Her younger sister, sleeping just feet away, had helplessly watched as a man with a knife led Elizabeth into the darkness. For 9 agonizing months, the world searched. But behind the headlines and heartbreak, another figure quietly enabled the crime. Wanda Bazi, the woman who stood by as a child, was held captive, claiming it was all part of God's divine plan. Wanda Bazi was born and raised in Utah, deeply embedded in the Latter-day Saint community. However, her life followed a chaotic trajectory. By the early 2000s, she had become estranged from much of her family, struggled with mental illness, and had immersed herself in fringe religious beliefs. Alongside her husband, Brian David Mitchell, she had abandoned mainstream Mormonism in favor of a distorted theology, one where Mitchell proclaimed himself a prophet and Bazi accepted his every declaration as divine truth. In 2002, Mitchell began claiming that God had commanded him to take multiple wives in preparation for an approaching apocalypse. He insisted he was fulfilling a sacred mission, and Bazi didn't merely tolerate this delusion. She actively supported it. That mission would tragically lead them to Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, Mitchell broke into the Smart family home during the early morning hours. Bazi waited nearby, reportedly assisting with planning the abduction. Once Mitchell had taken Elizabeth into the mountains behind Salt Lake City, it was Bazzi who performed the so-called wedding ceremony, binding the terrified teenager to Mitchell as a spiritual wife. For the following 9 months, Elizabeth was forced to live in a makeshift camp just miles from her own home, subjected to religious indoctrination, abuse, and threats of divine punishment if she resisted or attempted to escape. Bazzi's role during this ordeal was far from passive. She helped disguise Elizabeth's appearance, monitored her movements constantly, and reinforced Mitchell's twisted theology at every opportunity. When Elizabeth cried or begged to return home, Bazzi would scold her and remind her of her supposed sacred duty. Investigators and prosecutors later revealed that Bazzi would sing hymns and read scripture aloud to justify the ongoing abuse, all while ensuring Elizabeth remained completely isolated from the outside world. Despite being spotted multiple times in public with Mitchell and Elizabeth, who wore a veil and went by an alias, law enforcement was unable to act without clear evidence. It wasn't until March 2003, when a vigilant citizen recognized the trio in Sandy, Utah, that Elizabeth was finally rescued. Police stopped them on the street. Elizabeth initially hesitated, but then confirmed her true identity. After 276 days in captivity, she was finally going home. Mitchell and Bazzi were arrested immediately. The legal process dragged on for years as both defendants underwent extensive psychiatric evaluations. Mitchell was ultimately convicted in 2010 and sentenced to life in prison. Bazzi, meanwhile, accepted a plea agreement in 2009. She pleaded guilty to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. In court, she admitted to her role in Elizabeth Smart's abduction in captivity, but her statements were erratic and inconsistent. One moment apologetic, the next deflective or disconnected. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Due to time already served in custody and credit for good behavior, she was released in 2018, a decision that shocked and outraged much of the public. Elizabeth Smart, now an adult and a prominent advocate for missing children, was outspoken about Bazzi's release. She called it incomprehensible, emphasizing that Bazzi had shown no genuine remorse and still potentially posed a threat. Authorities confirmed that even while in prison, Bazzi had expressed continued support for Mitchell's apocalyptic beliefs and had refused to take medication for her diagnosed mental illnesses. Bazzi's release came with strict conditions, lifetime supervision, GPS monitoring, and restrictions on proximity to children. She was placed in a supervised residence in Salt Lake City, but her presence sparked protests and significant concern from local residents, especially given her proximity to schools and houses of worship. She has remained largely invisible to the public since her release, but the legacy of her involvement persists. The broader impact of the Smart kidnapping case proved profound. It led to significant reforms in how child abductions are handled across the United States, including expansion of the Amber Alert system and improvements in cross-jurisdictional law enforcement collaboration. The case also brought national attention to religiously motivated abuse and the disturbing ways ideology can be weaponized to justify control and violence. Wanda Bazzi wasn't the one holding the knife the night Elizabeth Smart was taken, but she was the one who made escape feel impossible. She stood beside her husband not merely as a partner but as a true believer, using scripture as chains. And while she walks free today under supervision, the damage she helped inflict continues to echo in the life of the girl she once tried to transform into a servant of someone else's twisted prophecy. Case 7. Lori Vallow Daybell, Idaho. Rexburg, Idaho, September 2019. It began with a mother's eerily calm demeanor on a courtroom bench and ended with the discovery of 2 small bodies buried in a backyard grave. Behind the sensational headlines about missing children in courtroom drama lay something far darker, a chilling belief system that declared some people, even your own children, could be possessed by evil spirits and had to die to fulfill what she believed was a divine plan. Before the media dubbed her the Doomsday Mom, Lori Vallow Daybell appeared to lead a fairly conventional life. Born in California in 1973, she was a former beauty pageant contestant who worked in the Arizona suburbs as a wife and mother. Friends described her as charming, charismatic, and devoted to her family. However, over time, Lori became deeply obsessed with fringe religious teachings, interpretations that warped mainstream Mormon doctrine into something extreme and apocalyptic. That transformation intensified dramatically when she met Chad Daybell, a religious author and podcaster who claimed to receive prophetic vision from God. Chad had written numerous books centered on end-time scenarios, portraying himself as a spiritual warrior chosen to lead the faithful through an imminent apocalypse. When he and Lori met at a religious conference in 2018, their connection was instant and intense. They believed they were spiritually sealed for eternity, divine leaders handpicked for a sacred mission. Together, they constructed a framework of belief that would ultimately justify unthinkable crimes. By early 2019, Lori's grip on reality had visibly deteriorated. She began claiming that certain people around her had become zombies, individuals whose souls had been replaced by dark spirits. Among those she labeled as possessed were her own children, 16-year-old Tyler Ryan and 7-year-old J.J. Vallow. At the same time, she grew increasingly distant from family members, severing contact with relatives who raised questions or expressed concerns. In September 2019, both children vanished from their home in Rexburg, Idaho. Lori offered vague, shifting explanations. Tylee was supposedly away at college. J.J. was allegedly with a friend. But no one actually saw or heard from them. Strangely, Lori didn't report them missing. Instead, she went on vacation, married Chad just weeks after his wife Tammy's sudden and suspicious death, and relocated to Hawaii, seemingly unfazed by the growing questions and investigations. Meanwhile, the children's grandparents sounded the alarm. After repeated failed attempts to speak with J.J., they contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. Police in Rexburg launched an investigation that quickly grew more alarming. Lori and Chad had lied repeatedly about the children's whereabouts. Text messages revealed coordinated efforts to cover their tracks. When law enforcement finally obtained a warrant to search Chad's property in June 2020, they discovered what everyone feared: 2 shallow graves. Inside were remains of Tylee and J.J., buried just steps from Chad's backyard fire pit. The details of the case only grew more disturbing from there. Investigators uncovered a timeline filled with manipulation and death. Lori's previous husband, Charles Vallow, had been killed by her brother months before the children disappeared. Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly and was buried without an autopsy until mounting suspicions prompted her exhumation. Evidence suggested a coordinated plan executed by Lori, Chad, and a small circle of followers, all fueled by their apocalyptic belief system. They viewed certain deaths as spiritually necessary, part of a cleansing ritual to prepare for the second coming of Christ. The legal process proved lengthy and emotionally charged. Lori Vallow Daybell was eventually charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft in connection with her children's deaths and the suspicious death of Tammy Daybell. During her 2023 trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman driven by delusion, ambition, and blind faith in a man who claimed to speak for God. The courtroom heard chilling testimony about Lori's belief system and how she came to view her children as spiritually compromised, as obstacles rather than innocents. Her defense team argued that Lori had been manipulated by Chad and was mentally unwell, but jurors remained unconvinced. In May 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty on all major charges. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She displayed little emotion as the sentence was handed down. Public reaction to the case was intense and widespread. News outlets around the world followed every development, with many people struggling to comprehend how a mother could become convinced her children needed to die. The case sparked renewed conversations about religious extremism, mental health, and the dangers of unchecked online communities that feed radical beliefs. Authorities also faced criticism for delays in connecting various deaths: Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, and the children. Multiple jurisdictions were involved, and many now believe earlier intervention could have saved lives. Today, Lori remains incarcerated with no possibility of release. Chad Daybell also faces trial for his alleged role in the killings and could face the death penalty. As more evidence continues to emerge, the case continues to horrify and fascinate the public in equal measure. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story isn't the bizarre beliefs themselves. It's how far 2 people were willing to go to act on them. In the end, 2 young lives were lost not because of hatred or greed, but because the people closest to them claimed to love them while convinced they weren't really there anymore.